Victoria Thornridge's perfectly manicured finger pointed at Marcus's Chun's chest as she delivered the words that should have destroyed him. You're just a nobody. What the billionaire CEO didn't expect was that the maintenance worker she was trying to humiliate would look her in the eye and say something that would haunt her for weeks. Something that would crack the armor she'd spent years building. Something that would change both their lives forever. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The words hit Marcus Chun like a physical slap, echoing off the marble walls of the executive floor at Thornridge Industries. You're just a nobody. Victoria Thornridge didn't shout it. She didn't need to. Her voice was cold, measured, surgical in its precision as she stood there in her immaculate cream suit, one perfectly manicured finger pointed directly at his chest. The small crowd of executives behind her tried to hide their smirks, but Marcus could feel their amusement radiating across the pristine white hallway. He stood there in his maintenance uniform, a dark blue coverall with his name stitched over the pocket, holding a toolbox that suddenly felt impossibly heavy. It had started 20 minutes earlier when Marcus was called up to the 42nd floor to fix a malfunctioning thermostat in the main conference room. It was his third year working maintenance at Thornridge Industries, and he'd learned to make himself invisible. Keep your head down, do your work, go home to your daughter. That was the routine that kept him sane, the predictable rhythm that helped him survive each day since his wife Emma had died 3 years ago. The cancer had taken her quickly, and with her went his career, his savings, and nearly his will to live. The only thing that kept him going was 7-year-old Sophie, whose smile was the only light in his dark world. He'd been kneeling on the floor of the conference room, his tools spread out around him as he worked on the wall panel when the door burst open. Victoria Thornridge swept in, followed by her entourage of senior executives. She was talking rapidly into her phone, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Marcus immediately started gathering his tools, trying to make himself small, trying to disappear. I'll have the numbers to you by end of day, she was saying, her voice crisp and authoritative. The Hong Kong deal is a priority. No excuses. She ended the call with a decisive tap and finally seemed to notice Marcus's presence. Her eyes, ice blue and sharp as razors, swept over him with the kind of dismissive assessment one might give to a piece of furniture that was slightly out of place. You're not finished yet, she stated. Not asked. Marcus looked up from where he was crouched. Almost done, ma'am. Just need another 5 minutes to test the system. Her expression didn't change. We have a board meeting in 3 minutes. I need this room now. Marcus felt his stomach clench. The thermostat wasn't working yet. If he left now, the room would be uncomfortably cold, and he'd likely get written up for an incomplete job. He took a breath, keeping his voice respectful. I understand, ma'am, but the system isn't calibrated. If I leave now, the temperature won't regulate properly and it could actually get worse. The conference room might be too cold for your meeting. The silence that followed felt dangerous. Victoria Thornridge took a single step toward him, and the executives behind her fell completely silent. Did you just tell me no? Her voice was quiet, but there was something lethal in it. Marcus felt heat creep up his neck. No, ma'am. I'm just explaining that the repair isn't complete. If you'd like, I can come back after your meeting. That would be another 2 hours minimum, and you have the temperature fluctuating the entire time during your board presentation. He was trying to be helpful, trying to find a solution, but he could see her expression hardening with each word he spoke. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and when she spoke again, her voice could have frozen water. Let me explain something, she said, taking another step closer. Her perfume was expensive, something French and floral that probably cost more than his monthly rent. This conference room is where billion-dollar deals are made. This is where I run a company that employs 5,000 people. This is where decisions that shape entire markets happen. Her eyes bore into him. And you are a maintenance worker who is currently on his knees on my floor, telling me what I can and cannot do in my own building. Do you understand how absurd that is? Marcus felt something inside him start to crack. He'd spent 3 years swallowing his pride, accepting condescension, making himself small. He'd done it because he needed the job, because Sophie needed food and clothes and a roof over her head. He'd taken every dismissive comment, every time someone looked through him as if he didn't exist, every casual cruelty from people who saw his uniform and decided that meant he was less than human. But something about Victoria Thornridge's tone, the casual way she reduced his entire existence to an inconvenience in her schedule, pushed him past his carefully maintained boundaries. He stood up slowly, setting his tools down with deliberate care. When he straightened to his full height, he was surprised to find he was slightly taller than her, even in her expensive heels. He met her eyes directly, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, almost gentle. You're absolutely right, he said. This is your building, and these are billion-dollar decisions. But that thermostat is connected to the HVAC system for this entire floor. If I don't finish the calibration, there's a 30% chance it will trigger a cascade failure that could shut down cooling for the whole executive level. That would mean evacuating all the offices up here, canceling not just your meeting but everyone else's for the rest of the day, and calling in an emergency repair crew that would cost the company about $15,000. He paused, letting that sink in. Or I could finish the job in 5 minutes, and your meeting can start just slightly late with a perfectly functioning climate control system. Your choice, ma'am. The executives behind Victoria had gone completely still. One of them, a silver-haired man Marcus recognized as the CFO, looked like he was trying very hard not to laugh. Another, a younger woman with sharp features, had her hand over her mouth, but Victoria Thornridge's face had gone pale, then flushed with anger. "How dare you," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "How dare you stand here and lecture me? Do you have any idea who I am?" Marcus felt a strange calm settle over him. "Come, yes, ma'am. You're Victoria Thornridge, CEO of Thornridge Industries. You inherited this company from your father 5 years ago. You've grown the stock price by 40% and you're featured in Fortune magazine's list of most powerful women in business." He tilted his head slightly. "But right now, you're also someone who's about to make a very expensive mistake because you're too proud to. Listen to the person who actually knows how this building's systems work." That was when she said it. That was when she pointed her finger at his chest and delivered the words that would change everything. "You're just a nobody," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "A maintenance worker. A man who fixes toilets and changes light bulbs. You are completely and utterly replaceable. There are 1,000 people who would take your job in a heartbeat, and not one of them would have the audacity to speak to me the way you just did." She turned to one of her executives. "Call security. I want him escorted out of the building immediately. And contact HR. I want him fired before he reaches the ground floor." Marcus stood there as her words washed over him. He thought about Sophie, about the bills piling up on his kitchen table, about the fact that he had exactly $800 in his savings account. He thought about how hard it had been to find this job, how he'd applied to 63 positions before Thornridge Industries had given him a chance. He thought about starting over again, about the crushing weight of failure. And then he thought about Emma, about what she would say if she could see him now. She'd told him once, during one of their last conversations before the cancer took her ability to speak, that dignity wasn't something anyone could take from you. It was something you chose to keep or give away. He'd given away too much of his dignity over the past 3 years, so Marcus did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He smiled. It wasn't a bitter smile or a mocking one. It was genuine, almost peaceful, the smile of a man who had just remembered who he used to be. He looked at Victoria Thornridge, at her perfect suit and her perfect hair and her perfectly maintained expression of contempt, and he spoke in a voice that was utterly calm. "You're right about one thing," he said quietly. "I am replaceable. Everyone is. You, me, every person in this building. We're all just temporary occupants of our roles trying to do our best before we move on." He bent down and picked up his toolbox, his movements unhurried despite the security guards who were already approaching from down the hallway. "But here's what you're wrong about. I'm not a nobody. I'm a father to a 7-year-old girl who thinks I hung the moon. I'm the person who makes her breakfast every morning and reads her bedtime stories every night. I'm the man who's teaching her that kindness matters more than power, and that how you treat people when you don't have to be kind is the true measure of character." He straightened up and met her eyes again. "So yes, fire me. I'll find another job, but you'll still be the person who chose cruelty over 5 minutes of patience. And that's something you'll have to live with long after I've forgotten your name." The silence that followed was profound. Victoria Thornridge stood frozen, her fingers still pointing at him, but her expression had changed. The certainty had cracked, replaced by something that looked almost like shock. The executives behind her were no longer smirking. They were staring at Marcus with a mixture of disbelief and something that might have been respect. One of them, the silver-haired CFO, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Victoria," he said carefully, "maybe we should reconsider. The HVAC issue he mentioned is actually a legitimate concern, and we do have the Mercado investors arriving for the board meeting in just a few minutes." Victoria's eyes snapped to him, and for a moment Marcus thought she might turn her fury on the CFO instead, but she didn't. She just stood there, her perfectly composed mask slipping, revealing something underneath that looked almost vulnerable. It was just a flash, gone in an instant, but Marcus saw it. Beneath all that armor, beneath the designer clothes and the commanding presence, was a woman who looked deeply, profoundly tired. She lowered her hands slowly, and when she spoke, her voice had lost some of its edge. "How long did you say it would take?" "5 minutes, Marcus replied. "Maybe 7 if I'm being cautious." She was silent for another long moment, and Marcus could almost see the war happening behind her eyes. Pride versus pragmatism. Anger versus logic. Finally, she made a sharp gesture to the security guards who stopped their approach. "You have 5 minutes. she said, her voice clipped. Not 7, 5. Then she turned on her heel and walked out, her entourage scrambling to follow. The conference room door closed behind them with a decisive click, leaving Marcus alone in the sudden quiet. He let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding and knelt back down to finish the job. His hands were shaking slightly, adrenaline finally catching up with him, but he forced them steady. 5 minutes. He could do this in 5 minutes. He worked with focused intensity, his fingers moving through the familiar motions of testing circuits and calibrating sensors. 4 minutes and 30 seconds later, the thermostat beeped softly, the display showing a steady 72 degrees. Marcus packed up his tools, did a final check of his work, and stood up. He looked around the enormous conference room with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, its massive table that could seat 30 people, its walls decorated with abstract art that probably cost more than his annual salary. This was Victoria Thornridge's world, a world of power and money and influence that felt as foreign to him as the surface of Mars. He picked up his toolbox and walked out, closing the door quietly behind him. The executive floor was buzzing with activity now. The board members were arriving, men and women in expensive suits carrying leather briefcases and tablets. They moved past Marcus without seeing him, their conversations full of stock prices and quarterly projections and merger strategies. He was invisible again, just the maintenance guy in the blue coverall. It should have felt familiar, comfortable even, but something had shifted. He couldn't quite go back to being invisible, not after what had just happened. He made his way to the service elevator, the one the executives never used, and pressed the button for the basement level where the maintenance office was located. The elevator doors were just closing when a hand shot through, triggering the sensors to make them reopen. Marcus looked up, expecting another worker, and found himself face to face with the silver-haired CFO who'd spoken up during the confrontation. The man stepped into the elevator and the doors closed behind him, leaving them alone in the small space. There was a long moment of silence as the elevator began its descent. "I'm James Whitmore," the man said finally, extending his hand. Marcus hesitated for just a moment before shaking it. "Marcus Chun." Whitmore nodded as if confirming something he already knew. "I've been CFO here for 23 years. I worked with Victoria's father before he passed, and I've watched her grow into her role as CEO. He paused, his expression thoughtful. "In all those years, I've never seen anyone speak to her the way you just did." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. "I apologize if I was out of line, sir. I shouldn't have lost my temper." Whitmore held up a hand. "That's not what I meant. What I mean is that I've never seen anyone speak truth to her with that kind of dignity. Most people either grovel or attack. You did neither. You simply stood your ground and reminded her that respect is a two-way street." The elevator reached the basement and the doors opened, but Whitmore made no move to exit. He pressed the button to hold the doors closed. "Can I ask you something, Marcus? What did you do before you came here?" "What do you mean, before you were in maintenance? What was your career?" The question caught Marcus off guard. He hadn't talked about his past in years, had built walls around those memories because they hurt too much to examine. He was silent for so long that Whitmore looked like he was about to apologize for prying. "I was a structural engineer," Marcus finally said, the words tasting strange in his mouth. "I worked for Meridian Solution. I designed support systems for commercial buildings, calculated load distributions, stress points. I had a team of 12 people under me." Whitmore's eyebrows rose. "Meridian Solutions. I know that firm. They're one of the best in the country. What happened?" Marcus felt the familiar weight settle on his chest, the grief that never quite went away. "My wife got sick, stage 4 cancer. By the time they found it, there wasn't much they could do. I took leave to care for her, and she held on for 8 months. When she passed, I couldn't go back. I couldn't think, couldn't focus. The calculations that used to be second nature felt impossible. I'd stare at blueprints and see nothing but her hospital room." He swallowed hard. "I lost the job, burned through our savings paying medical bills, and ended up here. It was the first place that would hire me without asking too many questions." Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, expression unreadable. Then he pulled out a business card from his wallet and handed it to Marcus. "This has my direct line on it. I want you to call me tomorrow morning at 9. Don't call the main office number. Call this one." Marcus took the card, confused. "Why?" "Because," Whitmore said, finally releasing the hold button and letting the doors open, "Victoria Thornridge isn't the only one who makes decisions at this company, and I think we've been wasting your talents in the basement." Marcus stood in the basement hallway watching the elevator doors close, the business card feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds in his hand. James Whitmore, Chief Financial Officer. Direct line. He turned it over in his fingers, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Part of him wanted to throw the card away, to forget the entire morning and go back to the safe, invisible life he'd built. But another part, a part that had been dormant for 3 years, was waking up. It was the part that remembered solving complex engineering problems at 3 in the morning, the thrill of seeing a design come together perfectly, the satisfaction of knowing his work was keeping people safe. He walked into the maintenance office, a cramped, windowless room lined with metal shelves full of supplies and tools. His supervisor, Dale, looked up from his desk, his weathered face creased with concern. "Chun, I heard there was an incident on 42. You okay?" Marcus set his toolbox down and nodded. "Fixed the thermostat. Job's done." Dale studied him for a moment, his eyes shrewd despite his casual demeanor. He'd been working maintenance at Thornridge Industries for 30 years and had seen everything. "Word is you had a run-in with the Ice Queen herself." Marcus almost smiled at the nickname. "Is that what they call her?" Dale snorted. "Among other things. Victoria Thornridge's got a reputation, and it's not for being warm and fuzzy. Her father, Old Man Thornridge, he was tough but fair, had respect for the people who kept this building running. But Victoria, she grew up in a different world. Boarding schools, Ivy League, executive training programs. She sees the world in terms of numbers and hierarchy, and if you're not at the top of that hierarchy, you barely register as human to her." He leaned back in his chair. "So what happened up there?" Marcus shrugged, trying to downplay it. She needed the conference room. I needed to finish the repair. We had a disagreement about priorities, and I told her that everyone is replaceable, including her. That I might be a maintenance worker, but I'm not a nobody. Dale's eyes went wide, and then he burst out laughing, a deep belly laugh that echoed off the concrete walls. Oh man, I wish I could have seen her face. Nobody talks to Victoria Thornridge like that. Nobody. Marcus pulled out the business card and showed it to Dale. The CFO gave me this. Asked me to call him tomorrow. Dale's laughter died instantly. He took the card and examined it carefully, then looked up at Marcus with new respect. Whitmore doesn't hand these out lightly. I've been here 3 decades and I've never gotten a direct line from anyone above middle management. Whatever you did up there, it made an impression. Marcus went home that evening to the small 2-bedroom apartment he shared with Sophie. It was on the 3rd floor of an old building in a neighborhood that was just starting to gentrify, which meant the rent was climbing faster than his salary. The apartment was clean but worn, furnished with secondhand items and memories. There were photos of Emma everywhere because Sophie needed to see her mother's face, needed to remember that she'd been loved fiercely, even if that love had been cut short. Marcus found his daughter at the kitchen table, her homework spread out in front of her, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration as she worked on a math problem. "Daddy," she said, looking up with a smile that never failed to break and mend his heart at the same time. "You're home early." Marcus glanced at the clock. It was 6:15, only 15 minutes earlier than usual. But Sophie tracked his schedule like a ship's captain monitoring the tides. "I finished my work a little faster today," he said, leaning down to kiss the top of her head. "How was school?" "It was good. We learned about fractions and Mrs. Peterson said I'm really good at them." She showed him her worksheet marked with gold stars. "I can see half of a pizza and a quarter of a pizza and all the pieces, Daddy. It's like a puzzle." Marcus sat down across from her, watching her face light up as she explained her newfound understanding of mathematical concepts. This was what mattered, not Victoria Thornridge's contempt or James Whitmore's mysterious business card or the fact that he'd nearly been fired that morning. This little girl with Emma's eyes and his stubborn chin, this miracle who depended on him completely, this was his entire world. But even as he thought it, he felt the business card burning in his pocket like a hot coal. He'd told Victoria that everyone was replaceable, but was he really content being replaced endlessly, moving from one low-wage job to another, never using the skills he'd spent years developing? That night, after Sophie was asleep, Marcus sat at the kitchen table and did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He opened his laptop and looked at his old resume. It was a document from another lifetime, full of impressive credentials and successful projects. Bachelor's degree in structural engineering from MIT. Master's from Stanford, 8 years at Meridian Solutions, rising from junior engineer to senior project manager. He'd worked on hospitals and schools and office towers, buildings where thousands of people would work and live and trust that the structure holding them up was sound. He'd been good at it, more than good. He'd been exceptional. But that was before Emma got sick, before the world tilted sideways and never quite righted itself. He'd thought about going back 100 times, but the idea of stepping back into that world felt impossible. It required a confidence he no longer possessed, a belief in himself that had died somewhere in the hospital corridors where he'd watched his wife fade away. Engineering was about certainty, about calculations you could trust absolutely. And Marcus no longer trusted anything absolutely. What if he made a mistake? What if his grief-clouded mind missed a critical stress point? What if a building he designed failed and people died? The weight of that possibility was crushing. He closed the laptop and picked up James Whitmore's business card instead. He turned it over and over in his hands, watching the light reflect off the embossed lettering. Why had the CFO given him this? What could a maintenance worker possibly offer to a man who operated in boardrooms and managed billion-dollar budgets? Unless Whitmore somehow knew about his background, but that was impossible. Marcus's employment file at Thornridge Industries was minimal. Just a basic application showing his work history for the last 3 years. His engineering career wasn't mentioned because he'd been afraid it would raise questions he couldn't answer. He thought about Victoria Thornridge standing in that hallway, her finger pointed at his chest, telling him he was a nobody. He'd responded with words about dignity and fatherhood, and he'd meant every syllable. But beneath those words was a deeper truth he hadn't articulated, a truth he was only now beginning to recognize. He'd been hiding. For 3 years, he'd been hiding from his potential, from his intelligence, from the man he used to be, because using those gifts without Emma there to share in his success felt like a betrayal. He told himself he was being practical, being humble, being a good father by taking whatever work he could find, but maybe he'd also been punishing himself. The next morning, Marcus stood outside Thornridge Industries at 8:45, the business card in his hand, trying to decide if he was going to make the call. The morning rush of employees flowed around him, men and women in business attire carrying coffee cups and talking on phones. He recognized a few faces, people he'd seen in elevators or passed in hallways, but none of them recognized him. In his maintenance uniform, he was part of the building's infrastructure, noticed only when something broke. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number before he could talk himself out of it. It rang twice before a crisp voice answered. James Whitmore. "Mr. Whitmore, it's Marcus Chun. You asked me to call this morning." There was a pause, and Marcus heard the sound of a door closing in the background. "Marcus, thank you for calling. I hope I didn't catch you at a bad time. I'm about to start my shift, but I have a few minutes. Good. I'll be direct because I respect your time. I did some research last night after our conversation. I have contacts at Meridian Solutions and I made a few calls. I know who you are, Marcus. I know what you were, and I know what you could be again if you'd let yourself. Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. The morning sounds of the city faded into white noise as he processed Whitmore's words. You had no right to investigate me, he said, but there was no real anger in his voice, only a weary resignation. You're right, Whitmore replied calmly. I didn't, but I'm old enough that I've learned to trust my instincts. And yesterday my instincts told me that a man who could explain HV8 cascade failures with that level of technical detail and speak about dignity with that kind of conviction wasn't just a maintenance worker who'd stumbled into the job. So I made some calls. Your former supervisor at Meridian, Thomas Brennan, he spoke very highly of you. Said you were the best structural engineer he'd ever worked with. Marcus closed his eyes. Memories flooding back. Tom Brennan had been more than a supervisor. He'd been a mentor, a person who'd believed in Marcus when he was fresh out of graduate school and eager to prove himself. They'd worked together on the Providence Medical Center project, a 12-story hospital that had required innovative load-bearing solutions because of the unstable soil. Marcus had spent 6 months running calculations, testing models, revising designs until he'd created something elegant and safe. When the building opened, Tom had taken him to dinner and told him he had a gift, that he could see structural problems the way poets saw metaphor, finding connections and solutions that others missed. What else did Tom tell you? Marcus asked quietly. That your wife died and you disappeared. That he tried to reach out a dozen times but you never responded. That he assumed you'd left the field entirely and he hoped you'd found peace. Whitmore paused. He also said that if you ever wanted to come back to call him, that there would always be a place for you at Meridian. But you never called. No, Marcus admitted. I couldn't. I can't. Mr. Whitmore, I appreciate whatever you're trying to do here, but I left engineering for a reason. I'm not that person anymore. Are you sure about that? Whitmore asked. Because yesterday, when you explained that thermostat issue to Victoria, you weren't speaking as a maintenance worker. You were speaking as an engineer who understands systems, who sees the bigger picture, who thinks 3 steps ahead to prevent problems before they cascade. Marcus leaned against the building's exterior wall, feeling the cool stone against his back. It was just a thermostat. It was pattern recognition and problem solving, and the kind of technical fluency that took years to develop. You don't lose that, Marcus. You can bury it, but you don't lose it. Whitmore's voice softened. I'm not asking you to be who you were. I'm asking if you want to be who you could become. We have an opening in our facilities engineering department. It's not structural work, it's building systems. But it would use your skills, and it would pay 3 times what you're making now. Come to my office at noon. Let's talk about it properly. Marcus wanted to say no. Every instinct screamed at him to decline, to stay in the safe, narrow lane he'd carved out for himself. But then he thought about Sophie, and about the way her shoes were getting too small, and how he'd been putting off buying new ones because money was tight. He thought about the stack of medical bills that still arrived occasionally, final notices from collections agencies for debts he'd never be able to fully repay. He thought about the tiny apartment and the ancient car that needed repairs he couldn't afford. And beneath all of that, buried so deep he almost didn't recognize it, was a tiny spark of something that might have been hope. I'll be there at noon, he said. Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. Marcus went through his rounds mechanically, fixing a leaking faucet on the 10th floor, replacing fluorescent bulbs in the accounting department, checking the backup generator in the sub-basement. His mind was elsewhere, running through scenarios, weighing possibilities, fighting with his own fear. At 11:45, he went to the locker room in the basement and changed out of his coverall into the only decent clothes he owned, the dark gray slacks and button-down shirt he wore to parent-teacher conferences. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. When had he gotten so tired looking? When had those lines appeared around his eyes? He took the elevator to the executive floor, his heart pounding harder with each ascending number. The doors opened onto a world of hushed elegance, thick carpet and original artwork, and the kind of quiet that only money could buy. A receptionist directed him to Whitmore's office, a corner suite with windows overlooking the city. The CFO was waiting for him, seated at a conference table rather than behind his imposing desk, a gesture Marcus recognized as deliberately informal. He gestured to the chair across from him. Sit, please. Thank you for coming. Marcus sat, his hands folded in his lap, trying not to feel like he was being interviewed for a job he wasn't qualified for. Let me show you something, Whitmore said, sliding a folder across the table. Marcus opened it and found himself looking at building schematics. This is Thornridge Tower, Whitmore explained, our headquarters building where we're sitting right now. It was built in 1978, which means it's nearly 50 years old. We've done regular maintenance, of course, but the building is showing its age in ways that concern me. We've had increasing problems with the HVAC system, electrical issues, even some minor structural. Marcus studied the schematics with eyes that hadn't looked at technical drawings in years but still understood their language instinctively. He could see immediately what Whitmore was talking about. The building had been designed in an era of different codes and different materials. Retrofitting modern systems into that older framework created stress points and inefficiencies. I brought in 3 different engineering firms for assessments, Whitmore continued. They've all given me reports that are technically competent but fundamentally useless. They tell me what's wrong but not how to fix it without shutting down the entire building for months, which would cost us tens of millions millions in lost productivity. Marcus nodded slowly, his finger tracing a line on the schematic. The main problem is here. Your central HVAC trunk line is running through what was originally designed as a load-bearing wall. When they renovated in the 90s, they compromised the structural integrity to accommodate the new system. Now you've got temperature regulation issues because the airflow is restricted. But you can't just open up the wall more without reinforcing the load distribution. Whitmore leaned forward, his eyes intent. Exactly, that's exactly what the last engineering firm told me. Except it took them 40 pages and 3 months to say it. You saw it in 30 seconds. Marcus felt something stirring inside him. That old familiar thrill of solving a puzzle, of seeing patterns that others missed. It's not an impossible fix. You'd need to install supplementary support columns here and here, which would take up some interior space, but not much. Then you could widen the HVAC trunk and improve the airflow. You'd probably want to do it in phases, one floor at a time, so you don't have to evacuate the building. 6 months, maybe 8, but the building would stay operational throughout. How much would that cost? Whitmore asked. Marcus did quick mental calculations, factoring in materials, labor, permits, the cost of working around an occupied building. Rough estimate, probably between 2 and 3 million, depending on what you find when you open up the walls. There are always surprises in buildings this old. Whitmore sat back with a smile. The last firm quoted me 7 million in 18 months. Marcus, I need someone who thinks like you, who can solve these problems elegantly and efficiently. I need someone who understands that buildings are living systems, not just collections of materials. His voice grew serious. But more than that, I need someone who has the courage to speak truth to power, the way you did to Victoria yesterday. Marcus looked down at the schematics, his mind already racing ahead to solutions and strategies. This is what he'd been trained for, what he'd spent years of his life learning to do. But the fear was still there, a voice that whispered he'd lost his edge, that he'd fail, that he had no right to step back into this world. Mr. Whitmore, I appreciate this more than I can say, but I need to be honest with you. I'm not sure I can do this. It's been 3 years since I worked as an engineer. What if I've lost it? What if I make a mistake? Whitmore studied him for a long moment. Can I tell you something about Victoria Thornridge? She took over this company when she was 32 years old, right after her father died suddenly of a heart attack. She had an MBA and some board experience, but she'd never run anything. Everyone expected her to fail. The board members, the executives, even her own mother thought she should sell the company. Whitmore's expression grew distant, as if he were looking back through years of memories. But she didn't sell. She spent 18-hour days learning every aspect of this business. She made mistakes, big ones, and she learned from them. She fired people who doubted her and promoted people who believed in the work rather than the hierarchy. In 5 years, she transformed this company from a regional player into a national force. She's brilliant, driven, and absolutely ruthless when she needs to be. He paused, meeting Marcus's eyes. She's also terrified of failure because she knows what it costs her to succeed. That's why she's so hard on people. It's not cruelty for its own sake. It's armor. Marcus thought about the woman who'd pointed her finger at his chest and called him a nobody. He tried to reconcile that image with what Whitmore was describing, a young woman thrust into impossible circumstances and somehow rising to meet them. It doesn't excuse how she treats people. You're absolutely right, Whitmore. It doesn't. But understanding why someone does something doesn't mean excusing it. It just means seeing the whole picture. He leaned forward. Here's what I know about you, Marcus. You lost your wife and you buried yourself in grief. You took a job that was beneath your abilities because it felt safe, because it didn't ask anything of you except showing up and doing simple tasks. But yesterday, when Victoria pushed you, you didn't fold. You stood up and reminded her that everyone deserves respect, regardless of their position. But courage. And now I'm asking you to have a different kind of courage. The courage to believe in yourself again. The courage to step back into the work you were meant to do. Whitmore slid another document across the table. This is an employment offer. Facilities engineer, starting salary of $90,000 a year with full benefits, including health insurance that would cover Sophie completely. You'd report directly to me, and your first project would be developing a comprehensive plan for the Thornridge Tower renovations. Marcus stared at the paper, the numbers blurring slightly. $90,000. That was more than he'd made even at the height of his career at Meridian. That was enough to move to a better apartment, to buy Sophie new shoes without checking his bank balance first, to start paying down the mountain of debt that haunted him. But it was also a door he'd closed 3 years ago, and opening it again felt like stepping off a cliff. I need time to think about this, he said finally. Of course. Whitmore stood, extending his hand. Take the weekend. Call me Monday morning with your decision. But Marcus, whatever you decide, I want you to know something. Yesterday, when you stood up to Victoria, you did more than defend yourself. You reminded everyone in that hallway that dignity isn't determined by job titles. That matters. That means something. Marcus shook his hand and left the office, the employment offer folded carefully in his pocket. He walked to the elevator in a daze, his mind spinning with possibilities and fears in equal measure. The doors opened and he stepped inside, pressing the button for the basement. He needed to finish his shift, needed the familiar routine to ground him while his world tilted on its axis. The elevator stopped on the 42nd floor. The doors opened and Victoria Thornridge stepped in. For a frozen moment, they stared at each other. She was alone, no No entourage of executives, no armor of company business. Just a woman in a perfectly tailored suit with eyes that looked, for the first time, uncertain. The doors closed, sealing them into the small space together. The silence was thick and uncomfortable. Marcus watched the numbers descending and tried to think of something to say, some way to break the tension, but it was Victoria who spoke first. "I owe you an apology." The words were stiff, unpracticed, as if she wasn't used to saying them. "Yesterday I was out of line. I spoke to you with disrespect and I was wrong." Marcus turned to look at her fully. She was staring straight ahead at the elevator doors, her posture rigid. An apology clearly cost her something, and he could see the effort it took. He thought about all the things he could say, all the ways he could respond. He could accept graciously. He could be petty and make her squirm. He could brush it off and pretend it didn't matter. Instead, he told her the truth. "Thank you for saying that. It wasn't easy for you, and I appreciate it. But I think we both know that wasn't really about the thermostat or the conference room." She glanced at him sharply, a flash of the Ice Queen returning. "What do you mean?" Marcus chose his words carefully. "I mean that you're under enormous pressure every day to prove yourself, to live up to your father's legacy, to show everyone who doubted you that they were wrong. And when someone challenges you, even about something small, it feels like the whole tower of your authority might come crashing down. So you respond with overwhelming force to remind everyone, including yourself, that you're in control." He held her gaze. "But real power doesn't need to prove itself. Real power can afford to be kind." The elevator reached the basement and the doors opened, but neither of them moved. Victoria stared at him with an expression he couldn't quite. Anger maybe, or shock, or something that looked almost like recognition. "Who are you?" she asked quietly. "I'm just a maintenance worker," he said with a slight smile. "Remember? Told me so yourself." But he stepped out of the elevator and turned back. "Or maybe I'm someone who knows what it's like to build walls around yourself because you're afraid of being hurt again. Good luck with your board meeting, Miss Thornridge." He walked away before she could respond, leaving her standing in the elevator with his words hanging in the air between them. That evening, Marcus picked up Sophie from after-school care and took her to their favorite place in the city, a small park with a duck pond and walking trails. They bought a bag of breadcrumbs from the vendor and sat on their usual bench, tossing pieces to the ducks that waddled hopefully around their feet. "Daddy," Sophie said, throwing a particularly large crumb that caused a minor duck riot. "You seem different today. Different how, sweetheart?" "I don't know. Just different, like you're thinking about big things." Marcus smiled and pulled her close. "Maybe I am. How would you feel if we moved to a bigger apartment? One where you could have your own room?" Sophie's eyes went wide. "My own room, really? Would it have space for all my stuffed animals?" "It would have space for a whole zoo of stuffed animals." Wanted. She squealed and threw her arms around his neck. "That would be so amazing, Daddy." "Is that really going to happen?" Marcus hesitated. He hadn't made his decision yet, hadn't committed to Whitmore's offer. But looking at his daughter's excited face, he felt the balance tipping. "Maybe," he said carefully. "I got offered a different job today, a better one. But it would mean doing work I used to do before your mom got sick, and I'm not sure if I'm ready for that." Sophie pulled back and looked at him with a seriousness that seemed far too old for 7 years. "What kind of work?" "Engineering. Designing buildings and making sure they're safe. I used to be really good at it." Sophie considered this, her face thoughtful. "Is it work that Mom would be proud of you for doing?" The question hit Marcus like a fist to the chest. He thought about Emma, about the way she'd light up when he came home excited about solving a difficult problem. She'd always said she loved watching him work because he got this look on his face, this intense focus and joy that made him seem fully alive. After she got sick, that light had gone out of him, and he knew it had hurt her to watch him dim along with her failing body. Just before she died, she'd made him promise something. "Promise me you'll be happy again," she'd whispered, her voice barely audible. "Promise me you won't stop being Marcus." He'd promised, but he'd broken that promise. For 3 years, he'd been a ghost of himself, going through motions, surviving but not living. "Yes," he told Sophie, his voice rough with emotion. "I think Mom would be proud." "Then you should do it," Sophie said simply. She went back to feeding the ducks. The matter settled in her mind with the beautiful certainty of childhood. Marcus sat there watching her, watching the late afternoon sun turn the pond into liquid gold, and he felt something inside him unlock. Maybe Whitmore was right. Maybe courage wasn't about never being afraid. Maybe it was about being afraid and doing the thing anyway because the people you love deserve to see you try. He pulled out his phone and typed a message before he could second-guess himself. "Mr. Whitmore, I've made my decision. I accept the position. When can I start?" Whitmore's response came back within minutes. "Monday morning, 8 o'clock. Welcome back to the world of engineering, Marcus." That weekend passed in a strange blur of emotion. Marcus cleaned out his locker in the basement maintenance office, said goodbye to Dale, who pumped his hand enthusiastically and told him it was about damn time, and tried to prepare himself for the seismic shift his life was about to undergo. He bought a new suit. Nothing expensive, but professional enough for an engineering position, and spent Sunday evening reviewing technical journals and industry publications, trying to catch up on 3 years of developments he'd missed. Sophie sensed his nervous energy and responded with her own excitement, drawing pictures of what she imagined his new office would look like, complete with a desk made of clouds and windows that showed outer space. Monday morning arrived with the weight of consequence. Marcus stood in front of the mirror in his new suit, adjusting his tie for the 3rd time. He barely recognized himself. The maintenance worker was gone, replaced by someone who looked like he belonged in the world of conference rooms and project timelines. Sophie appeared in the doorway, still in her pajamas, her hair sticking up at odd angles. "You look like a superhero, Daddy," she said, her voice full of sleepy pride. "Superheroes wear capes, sweetie, not the good ones. The good ones wear suits and save people without anyone knowing." She came over and hugged him tight. "You're going to be amazing. I know it." He arrived at Thornridge Industries at 7:45. Giving himself time to settle his nerves before reporting to Whitmore's office. The security guard at the front desk did a double take when Marcus showed his new employee badge. "Chun, that you? Used to be maintenance, right?" Marcus nodded. "Got promoted. Good for you, man." The guard smiled genuinely. "You always said please and thank you. Treated us like people. Most folks here don't." Marcus took the elevator to the executive floor, his heart hammering. The receptionist directed him to a different office than Whitmore's, a smaller but still impressive space with windows overlooking the city. Inside, he found not just Whitmore, but two other people. A woman in her 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a younger man with the eager intensity of someone fresh out of graduate school. "Marcus Chun, meet your team," Whitmore said, gesturing. "This is Patricia Reeves, Senior Facilities Manager. She's been here for 20 years and knows every pipe and wire in this building. And this is Kevin Park, Junior Engineer. He graduated from Carnegie Mellon last year." Patricia extended her hand with a firm grip and a measuring look. "So you're the maintenance worker who stood up to the Ice Queen. Word travels fast around here. I heard you made her apologize." Marcus shook her hand, uncomfortable with the attention. "I just asked for basic respect. Nothing heroic about that." Patricia's eyes crinkled with approval. "You'd be surprised how rare that is. Most people either grovel or run when Victoria Thornridge turns her attention on them. Welcome to the team. I have a feeling we're going to get along just fine." Kevin was practically vibrating with excitement. "Mr. Chun, I read your papers on dynamic load distribution and mixed material structures. The work you did on the Providence Medical Center was brilliant. That solution to the soil instability problem should be taught in every engineering program." Marcus felt heat rise in his face. "That was a long time ago. I'm pretty rusty now." "Maybe, but rust can be polished off." Kevin grinned. "I'm just excited to work with someone who thinks outside the box. Most of the engineers who come through here just want to follow the standard protocols and collect their paychecks." Whitmore cleared his throat, calling the meeting to order. "Let's get down to business. Marcus, your primary project is the Thornridge Tower renovation, but that's a long-term effort. We need assessments and planning before we can start any actual work. In the meantime, I want you working with Patricia and Kevin on immediate issues." "Patricia, fill them in." She pulled out a tablet and brought up a list that made Marcus's eyes widen. "We have HVAC problems on floors 12, 28, and 35. Electrical fluctuations in the south wing that are causing computer crashes. A persistent water leak somewhere in the west stairwell that we can't locate. And structural concerns about the parking garage on sublevel 2 where we've noticed some new cracking in the support columns." Marcus felt the familiar thrill of problem-solving kick in. That mental shift into engineering mode where every challenge became a puzzle waiting to be solved. "Let's start with the parking garage. Structural issues are the most critical. If those support columns are failing, we need to know immediately." He turned to Kevin. "Can you pull the original construction documents and any inspection reports from the last 10 years? "Already done," Kevin said, pulling up files on his laptop. "I compiled everything this weekend when I heard you were joining us." Marcus spent the next hour poring over documents, asking questions, sketching quick diagrams. It felt like coming home after a long exile, like muscles he hadn't used in years remembering their purpose. Patricia watched him work with growing respect, occasionally adding insights about the building's quirks and history. By 9 o'clock, they had a plan. Marcus would do a site inspection of the parking garage that afternoon with Kevin. Then they'd run stress calculations to determine if the cracking was cosmetic or critical. If it was critical, they'd need to bring in reinforcement immediately and potentially close sections of the garage. If it was cosmetic, they could address it during routine maintenance. The morning flew by in a blur of technical discussions and project planning. Marcus found himself falling back into old patterns, the language of engineering coming naturally despite his 3-year absence. It was like riding a bicycle, fundamentals still there, even if he was a bit wobbly at first. Just before noon, Whitmore stuck his head into the office. "Marcus, can I see you for a moment?" Marcus followed him down the hall to his larger corner office. Once inside with the door closed, Whitmore's expression grew serious. "I need to tell you something. Victoria knows about your new position. I informed her this morning per company protocol. Any new hire at this level requires CEO approval." "How did she take it?" Marcus asked, though he could guess. "She was surprised, to put it mildly. She asked if this was some kind of joke or if I was deliberately trying to undermine her authority by promoting someone she'd nearly fired." Whitmore sat on the edge of his desk. "I told her the truth, that you're a brilliant engineer who's been wasting his talents and that this company would be foolish not to utilize your skills properly. I also reminded her that personnel decisions in my department are my purview, not hers." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. "So she's angry, she's conflicted," Whitmore correct. "Angry, yes, but also curious. Victoria didn't get where she is by ignoring talent, even when her ego is bruised. She asked to see your credentials, so I sent her your full background. Your MIT degree, your Stanford Masters, your work at Meridian. She knows exactly who you are now." The thought of Victoria Thornridge reading through his history Seeing his accomplishments and his collapse made Marcus uncomfortable in ways he couldn't quite articulate. It felt like an invasion, even though it was public information. She's gonna think I was hiding something. Were you? Whitmore asked mildly. Marcus considered the question. Maybe. I don't know. I wasn't trying to deceive anyone. I just wanted to be invisible for a while. Whitmore nodded. I understand that. But you're not invisible anymore, Marcus. You're going to be working on high-profile projects, presenting to executive committees, possibly even reporting directly to Victoria on the tower renovation. You need to be prepared for that. I don't know if I can work with her, Marcus admitted. Every time I see her, I'm going to remember her calling me a nobody. Then remember what you told her in response. That you're a father to a daughter who thinks you hung the moon, and that how people treat others when they don't have to be kind is the true measure of character. Whitmore's expression soft. Victoria needs to be reminded of that lesson regularly. Maybe having you around will be good for her. Marcus wasn't sure he wanted to be anyone's moral compass, but he nodded. Before he could respond further, there was a sharp knock on the door. Whitmore's secretary poked her head in, her expression apologetic. I'm sorry to interrupt, but Miss Thornridge is requesting an immediate meeting with you both in her office. Whitmore and Marcus exchanged glances. That was fast, Whitmore muttered. He stood up, straightening his suit jacket. Well, let's not keep her waiting. They walked down the hall to Victoria's office, a corner suite that made Whitmore's look modest by comparison. The walls were lined with awards and photographs, Victoria shaking hands with presidents and CEOs, speaking at conferences, accepting honors. Her desk was a massive piece of modern art in steel and glass, and behind it sat the woman herself, backlit by floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city's skyline. She looked up as they entered, her expression unreadable. Thank you for coming. Please sit. They settled into the uncomfortable modern chairs across from her desk. Victoria had a folder open in front of her, and Marcus recognized copies of his old resume, his published papers, his project portfolio from Meridian. She studied him for a long moment, and he forced himself to meet her gaze steadily. Marcus Chun, she said finally. MIT graduate, top 5% of your class. Stanford master's program where you wrote a thesis on adaptive structural systems that won the Morrison Prize. 8 years at Meridian Solutions where you rose from junior engineer to senior project manager. You've designed hospitals, schools, commercial towers. Your work on the Providence Medical Center was featured in Engineering Weekly as an innovative solution to a supposedly impossible problem. She closed the folder. And for the last 3 years, you've been unclogging toilets and changing light bulbs in my building. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Marcus knew what she wanted, an explanation, a justification, maybe an apology for the deception, but he'd already bared himself enough. He'd already explained his grief and his reasons to Whitmore. He didn't owe Victoria Thornridge his pain, so he simply said yes. That's an accurate summary of my resume. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. That's all you're gonna say? That's all that's relevant, Marcus replied calmly. My qualifications speak for themselves. Whether or not you believe I should have this position is between you and Miss Moore Whitmore. I'm here to do the work I was hired to do. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in front of her. You know what I find fascinating, Mr. Chun? Last week you were invisible to me. You were part of the building's infrastructure, noticed only when something broke. And now I discovered that one of the most talented structural engineers in the country has been working in my basement for 3 years, and I had no idea. That says something rather unflattering about me, doesn't it? The admission surprised Marcus. He'd expected defensiveness, perhaps anger at being deceived or dismissal of his credentials. He hadn't expected this kind of self-awareness. It says you're human, he said quietly. We all see what we expect to see. I wore a maintenance uniform, so that's what you saw. I didn't correct that assumption because I wasn't ready to be anything else. Victoria studied him for another long moment. Whitmore tells me you're going to oversee the Thornridge Tower renovation, that this building has problems that 3 other engineering firms couldn't solve adequately, but that you saw the solution in 30 seconds. That's correct. Show me. It wasn't a request. Victoria stood up and gestured to a large monitor on the wall. Marcus glanced at Whitmore, who gave a slight nod of encouragement. He stood and moved to the monitor, pulling up the building schematics from his tablet. This is your building as it was designed in 1978, he began, his voice shifting into the calm confidence of someone explaining something he understood completely. The original HVAC system was adequate for the technology and occupancy levels of that era, but in the 1990s renovation, they upgraded to a more powerful climate control system to accommodate increased server loads and higher occupancy density. He zoomed in on a specific section. The problem is they ran the new trunk line through this wall, which was part of the original load-bearing structure. They removed material to accommodate the larger ducts, which compromised structural integrity. Then they tried to compensate with this steel reinforcement, but they didn't account for thermal expansion. The metal heats and cools throughout the day, creating microstresses that have compounded over 30 years. Victoria moved closer to the screen, her attention completely focused. So we have both structural and climate control issues stemming from the same source. Exactly. The structural compromise isn't critical yet, but it's degrading. And the restricted airflow means your HVAC system is working at about 70% efficient, which is costing you approximately $400,000 a year in excess energy consumption. Marcus pulled up his preliminary sketches. The solution is to install supplementary load-bearing columns here, here, and here. They'd be encased in architectural elements so they'd look like design features rather than structural necessity. Once we've redistributed the load, we can safely widen the HVAC trunk. The whole thing can be done in phases over 6 to 8 months without evacuating the building. Total cost would be around $2.3 million. And how does that compare to the other proposals you've seen? Victoria asked Whitmore. The best one was $7 million in 18 months with a full building evacuation, Whitmore replied. The worst was $12 million over 2 years. Victoria's expression shifted into something that might have been respect. You saw all of this from a thermostat malfunction. I saw the pattern, Marcus corrected. When you work in maintenance, you develop an instinct for how systems connect. A thermostat problem on the 42nd floor shouldn't affect the 38th, but it was. That suggested the issue wasn't local, it was systemic. Once I understood that, the rest was just following the logic. She returned to her desk and sat down, her posture thoughtful. Mr. Chun, I'm going to be direct with you. I don't like being wrong, and I don't like being made to look foolish. When I called you a nobody, I was both. You could have revealed your background then, embarrassed me in front of my executives, made me look like an arrogant fool. The thought never crossed my mind, Marcus said honestly. I wasn't playing some game or setting up a gotcha moment. I was just trying to finish my job and go home to my daughter. In that moment, my background didn't matter because you'd already decided who I was based on my uniform. Nothing I said would have changed your mind. You're probably right about that, Victoria admitted, and there was something almost rueful in her tone. I have a tendency to make snap judgments and defend them long past the point of reason. My father used to say it was my greatest strength and my greatest weakness. The ability to make quick decisions is valuable in business, but it becomes a liability when you stop listening to contradictory information. There was a vulnerability in her admission that Marcus hadn't expected. He found himself reassessing his image of her, adding complexity to what he'd assumed was a simple portrait of corporate arrogance. Mere Whitmore, Victoria said, turning to her CFO. I'm approving this hire in the tower renovation project. I want weekly progress reports, and I want to be consulted on any decisions that affect building operations, but the project is yours to run. She looked back at Marcus. Chun, I'm trusting you with a building that houses 5,000 employees and represents billions in assets. Trusting you despite the fact that our first interaction involved me nearly firing you. I hope the trust isn't misplaced. It won't be, Marcus said simply. Good, then we're done here. She picked up her phone, already moving on to the next crisis, the next decision. Marcus and Whitmore left the office in silence. Once they were safely in the elevator, Whitmore let out a low whistle. That went better than I expect. She actually admitted she was wrong. Does she do that often? Marcus asked. Never, Whitmore said flatly. I've worked with her for 5 years and I've never heard her admit fault, even privately. Whatever you did when you stood up to her, it made an impression. Either that or reading your credentials scared her. Victoria doesn't scare easily. Whitmore smiled. No, I think you surprised her. And Victoria Thornridge doesn't like being surprised, so she's trying to figure you out. The elevator doors opened on the facility's engineering floor. Be careful, Marcus. She's brilliant and driven, but she's also used to getting what she wants. Right now she wants this building fixed, so you're valuable to her. But value in Victoria's world is always conditional. Marcus nodded, filing away the warning. He spent the rest of the day doing what he loved, solving problems. He went down to sub-level 2 with Kevin and spent 2 hours examining the cracked support columns in the parking garage, took measurements, photographs, and concrete samples. Back in the office, they ran stress calculations, determined that the cracking was superficial, caused by settling and temperature fluctuations rather than structural failure. It could be repaired with epoxy injection and preventative maintenance. By 6 o'clock, Marcus had a comprehensive report ready, complete with cost estimates and timeline. It felt good, this kind of work. It felt right in a way nothing had felt right in 3 years. He picked up Sophie from after-school care and took her home, listening to her chatter about her day. Over dinner, simple pasta with the vegetables she always tried to avoid, he told her about his first day as an engineer. I went down into a parking garage and looked at cracks in concrete, he said. Sounds boring, Sophie observed, pushing a piece of broccoli around her plate. It was the best day I've had in a long time, Marcus admitted. She smiled at him, that brilliant smile that was so much like Emma's it made his heart ache. I'm glad, Daddy, you seem more like yourself, like how Mom used to say you were when she met you. Full of light, she called it. She said you got all bright when you talked about buildings and bridges and making things strong. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Marcus sat on their small balcony and looked out at the city lights. Somewhere out there was Thornridge Tower, standing tall because engineers had done their job correctly, calculating loads and stresses and safety factors. In a few months, he'd be working to make it stronger, to fix the compromises of the past and ensure it stood for decades more. It was a responsibility that would have terrified him a week ago. Now it felt like purpose, like a reason to get up in the morning beyond just survival. His phone buzzed with an email. It was from Victoria Thornridge, sent at 11:45 at night because apparently she never slept. The subject line read, "Parking Garage Report." He opened it with some trepidation, expecting criticism or questions. Instead, he found 3 words: thorough work. Thank you. It was perhaps the most human thing he'd seen from her, and it made him wonder what else lay beneath that icy exterior. The next 3 weeks fell into a rhythm that was both exhilarating and exhausting. Marcus threw himself into the work with an intensity he'd forgotten he possessed. He arrived early and stayed late, poring over building systems, running calculations, developing comprehensive plans for the tower renovation. Patricia and Kevin quickly became not just colleagues but friends, united by their shared mission to solve problems that others had deemed unsolvable. They worked well together. Patricia's practical knowledge combining with Kevin's theoretical brilliance and Marcus's ability to see patterns and connections that others missed. The office became a war room of sorts. Walls covered with diagrams and timelines, whiteboards filled with calculations and sketches. But it was the unexpected interactions with Victoria that made everything complicated. She had a habit of appearing unannounced, sweeping into their office with questions or requests, her presence immediately changing the energy in the room. At first, Marcus thought she was checking up on him, making sure he wasn't wasting the company's money or time, but gradually he realized it was something else. She was genuinely interested in the work, asking technical questions that showed she'd been reading the reports carefully, challenging assumptions, pushing them to think harder and better. It was during one of these impromptu visits that everything shifted. Marcus was alone in the office, working late on a Friday evening. Sophie was at a sleepover with her best friend, a rare occurrence that Marcus had decided to use for uninterrupted work time. He was so absorbed in a particularly tricky stress calculation that he didn't hear Victoria enter until she spoke. "Working late, Mr. Chun?" He looked up, startled. The office was dim, just his desk lamp creating a pool of light in the darkness. Victoria stood in the doorway and she looked different somehow. She'd removed her suit jacket and her hair was down rather than pulled back in its usual severe style. She looked tired and unexpectedly human. "I could say the same about you, Miss Thornridge. It's almost 9 o'clock on a Friday night." She walked into the office and looked at his calculations spread across the desk. "What are you working on?" "The load distribution for the supplementary columns. I'm trying to minimize the footprint while maximizing structural support. There's a sweet spot where we can use smaller columns that would be less intrusive visually, but I need to make sure they can handle the stress over long-term thermal cycling. May I?" She gestured to the chair beside his desk. Marcus nodded, surprised. She sat down and leaned in to study his work, and he caught a faint scent of her perfume, something subtle and expensive. "You're accounting for seismic activity," she observed, pointing to one of his calculations. "We're not in a major earthquake zone. No, but we get minor tremors occasionally, and over 50 years, even small stresses add up. Better to over-engineer now than have problems later." She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice had lost its usual commanding edge. "My father built this building, you know. Well, he didn't physically build it, but he commissioned it, oversaw every detail. He used to bring me here when I was a little girl before it was finished. We'd walk through the empty floors and he'd tell me that a building was like a promise. If you build it strong and build it right, it would stand long after you were gone. It would be your legacy." Marcus set down his pen and looked at her. She was staring at his calculations, but he had the sense she was seeing something else entirely. Maybe a memory of a man who'd meant the world to her. "That's a beautiful way to think about it," he said quietly. "It is, isn't it?" She smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "He died on the 38th floor in his office. Heart attack. He was there late working on a deal and he just collapsed. By the time they found him, it was too late." Marcus felt a pang of sympathy. "I'm sorry. That must have been devastating." "Everyone expected me to sell," she continued, as if she hadn't heard him. "The board, the investors, even my own mother. They all thought I was too young, too inexperienced, too emotional to run a company this size. And maybe they were right. Maybe I was all of those things. But this building was his promise, his legacy, and I couldn't let it go. So I learned. I made mistakes, fired people who were smarter than me, promoted people who believed in the work, and somehow we survived." Marcus understood then. The Ice Queen persona, the obsessive need for control, the way she treated the building like sacred ground. It wasn't just about business or ego. It was about keeping a promise to a father who'd believed in permanence, in things that lasted. "That's why the renovation matters so much to you," he said. "It's not just about efficiency or cost save. It's about keeping his promise alive, keeping the building strong." She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw a vulnerability that she rarely let anyone see. "Yes. And when you stood in that hallway and told me that dignity wasn't determined by job titles, when you refused to be invisible, I saw my father in you. He used to say the same thing, that the measure of a person wasn't their position but their character. I'd forgotten that somewhere along the way." Marcus felt something shift between them, a wall coming down. "You haven't forgotten. You've just been so focused on proving yourself that you forgot to see other people. But you can learn. We all can." She was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to do this, you know. This vulnerability thing, I'm not good at it." "None of us are good at it," Marcus said. "We're all just figuring it out as we go." Victoria stood up, and for a moment he thought she was going to leave, to retreat back behind her walls. But instead she walked over to the window and looked out at the city below. At the building, lights scattered like stars across the darkness. Can I tell you something I've never told anyone? Of course. When my father died, I was angry at him. Furious, actually, because he'd promised me he'd always be there, that we'd run this company together, that he'd teach me everything I needed to know, and then he just left. One minute he was planning our future, and the next he was gone, and I was alone with a company I didn't know how to run, and a promise I didn't know how to keep. She turned back to face him, so I became hard. I became the Ice Queen because if I let myself feel anything, I'd fall apart. And I couldn't afford to fall apart because 5,000 people depended on. Marcus stood and walked over to join her at the window. He understood her pain in a way that few people could because he'd lived his own version of it. I was angry at my wife when she died, he said quietly. I was furious that she left me alone with a toddler and a future I didn't know how to face. I was angry that all my education and intelligence couldn't save her, that I had to watch her slip away while I stood there helpless. So I buried myself in grief and hid from the world because it was easier than feeling the pain. They stood there together. Two people who'd built walls around their hearts for different reasons, but with the same result. Isolation and loneliness dressed up as strength. You know what my daughter told me? Marcus said. She told me that her mom would want me to be happy again. That hiding wasn't the same as he. She's 7 years old and she's smarter than I'll ever be. Victoria smiled, a real smile that softened her entire face. She sounds like an amazing kid. She is. She's the reason I took this job, the reason I'm standing here tonight, because I wanted her to see that it's possible to start over, to be brave even when you're terrified. Do you ever stop being terrified? Victoria asked. I don't know, Marcus admitted. But I think maybe being terrified and doing the thing anyway is what courage actually looks like. They stood in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching the city lights. Then Victoria turned to him, and there was something new in her expression, a openness that hadn't been there before. Thank you, Marcus. For what? For seeing me, for not being intimidated by the Ice Queen, and for reminding me that there's a person underneath the title. Marcus smiled. Anytime, Victoria. The use of her first name hung in the air between them, a small intimacy that marked a shift in their relationship. She didn't correct him, didn't retreat back into formality. Instead, she simply nodded, an acknowledgement of the new ground they were standing on. I should let you get back to your calculations, she said, and you should go home and get some rest. It's Friday night. Even workaholics need to sleep occasionally. I'll make you a deal, she said, and there was a hint of playfulness in her voice that he'd never heard before. I'll go home if you go home. Fair enough, Marcus agreed. He started gathering his papers, and Victoria moved toward the door, but she paused in the doorway and looked back. Marcus? Yes. Monday morning, I'd like you to present your preliminary renovation plan to the board. They need to approve the budget, and I think it would be more effective coming from you directly rather than filtered through reports. He felt his stomach tighten with nerves, but nodded. I can do that. I know you can, she said simply. And then she was gone, leaving Marcus alone in the dim office with his calculations and a strange new feeling in his chest that might have been hope, or might have been something more complicated that he wasn't ready to examine too closely. Monday morning arrived with the weight of consequence. Marcus stood outside the boardroom at 7:55, his presentation loaded on his tablet, his palms slightly sweaty despite his best efforts at calm. Through the glass walls, he could see the board members assembling, powerful men and women who controlled billions in assets and made decisions that shaped markets. Patricia appeared beside him carrying a coffee cup. She pressed it into his hand. You look like you need this more than I do. Thanks. I'm more nervous than I thought I'd be. Patricia smiled. That's because you care about getting it right. The people who should be nervous are the ones who walk in there cocky and unprepared. You've done the work, Marcus. Now just show them what you know. The boardroom doors opened and Whitmore gestured for him to enter. The room fell silent as Marcus walked to the head of the massive conference table. 12 board members watched him with varying degrees of curiosity and skepticism. Victoria sat at the far end, her expression neutral, giving nothing away. Good morning, Marcus began, his voice steady despite his nerves. Thank you for taking the time to hear this presentation. I'm Marcus Chun, facilities engineer, and I'm here to discuss the comprehensive renovation plan for Thornridge Tower. He pulled up the first slide, a three-dimensional rendering of the building with problem areas highlighted in red. This building has served this company well for 47 years, but it's showing its age in ways that are costing you money and efficiency. Over the next 30 minutes, I'm going to show you how we can address these issues, extend the building's useful life by another 50 years, and save approximately $12 million compared to alternative solutions. He had their attention now. Board members leaned forward, tablets out, ready to take notes. Marcus walked them through the technical issues, explaining complex engineering concepts in language they could understand. He showed them the compromised load-bearing walls, the inefficient HVAC system, the electrical infrastructure that was straining under modern demands. Then he showed them his solution, elegant in its simplicity, but sophisticated in its execution. The supplementary columns that would look like architectural features, the phased renovation that would keep the building operational throughout, the energy efficiency improvements that would pay for themselves in 7 years. One board member, a stern woman named Elizabeth Morrison, raised her hand. Mr. Chun, we've had 3 previous engineering assessments that quoted significantly higher costs and longer timelines. Why should we believe your numbers are accurate? It's a fair question, Marcus replied. The other firms were approaching this as a comprehensive rebuild, essentially gutting sections of the building and starting over. That's the conservative approach, and it works, but it's expensive and disruptive. I'm proposing something more surgical. We identify the specific failure points, address them directly, and integrate modern systems into the existing structure. It's more complex from an engineering standpoint, but it's faster and more cost-effective. Another board member, an older man with silver hair, spoke up. And you're confident you can manage a project of this scope? You've been with the company for what, 3 weeks? Marcus felt the familiar sting of doubt but pushed it aside. He thought about Victoria's words, about courage being the act of doing the thing even when you're terrified. I was with Meridian Solutions for 8 years before I came. I have managed projects of similar complexity, including the Providence Medical Center, which had unique structural challenges that required innovative solutions. I'm confident in my abilities, but more importantly, I'm confident in this plan. I wouldn't present it to you if I thought there was any risk of failure. Victoria spoke for the first time, her voice cutting through the murmurs of discussion. I've reviewed Muskinum plan in detail. I've consulted with independent structural engineers who confirmed his calculations. I've also looked at his track record, and it's exemplary. I'm recommending that we approve this proposal and move forward with the renovation. The board members looked at each other, silent conversations happening in glances and slight nods. Finally, Morrison spoke. I move that we approve the proposed renovation plan with a budget cap of $3 million and a timeline of 8 months. Whitmore seconded the motion. All in favor? 12 hands rose in unison. The motion carries, Morrison said. Mr. Chun, congratulations. Don't make us regret this decision. Marcus felt a wave of relief so intense it almost made him dizzy. I won't, he said simply. The meeting adjourned and board members filed out, a few stopping to shake his hand and offer congratulations. Victoria remained seated at the far end of the table, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. When the room was finally empty except for the two of them, she stood and walked over to him. That was well done, she said. You made complex engineering concepts accessible without being condescending. That's a rare skill. Marcus felt heat rise in his face at the praise. Thank you, and thank you for backing me up when Morrison questioned my qualifications. I was just stating facts, Victoria said, but there was a hint of warmth in her voice. You earned that approval on your own merit. She hesitated, and for a moment she looked uncertain, vulnerable in a way that seemed at odds with the boardroom setting. Would you have dinner with me tonight? There's something I want to discuss about the project, and I'd prefer to do it somewhere less formal than the office. Marcus knew he should probably decline, should maintain professional boundaries, but something in her expression made him say yes. He spent the rest of the day in meetings with Patricia and Kevin, finalizing preliminary plans, assigning tasks, building timeline. The excitement of the approved project gave everything a sense of momentum and purpose. At 6 o'clock, he left to pick up Sophie from after-school care. She was waiting for him with a huge smile and a painting she'd made in art class. It's our new apartment, Daddy. See, this is my room with all the windows, and this is your room, and this is the kitchen where we make pancakes on Saturdays. Marcus hugged her tight, overwhelmed by love for this little person who believes so completely in their future. By the way, sweetie, I have to go to a work dinner tonight. Mrs. Rodriguez is going to stay with you, okay? Sophie's face fell slightly, but she nodded. Is it important work stuff? Very important, Marcus assured her. I'm having dinner with my boss to talk about the building project. Is your boss nice? Marcus thought about that question, about the complex woman who'd called him a nobody and then trusted him with millions of dollars and her father's legacy. She's learning to be, he said finally, just like I'm learning to be brave. That evening, Marcus met Victoria at a small Italian restaurant tucked away on a quiet street, the kind of place that didn't advertise and relied on word of mouth. It was intimate and warm, a world away from the corporate tower where they usually interacted. Victoria was already seated when he arrived, and she'd changed from her work suit into a simple navy dress that made her look younger, less intimidating. Marcus, thank you for coming, she said as he sat down. I know this is probably awkward. A little, he admitted, but I'm curious about what you wanted to discuss. They ordered wine and food, and for the first few minutes they talked about safe topics, the board presentation, the renovation timeline, technical details that felt comfortable and familiar. But as the wine arrived and they settled into the quiet rhythm of the meal, Victoria's expression grew more serious. I didn't actually ask you here to discuss the project, she said finally. I mean, we can talk about it if you want, but that's not the real reason. But what's the real reason? Marcus asked gently. Because I wanted to apologize properly. Not the stiff corporate apology I gave you in the elevator, but a real one. Victoria set down her wine glass and met his eyes. When I called you a nobody, I was speaking from my own fear and insecurity. I was lashing out because you challenged me, and I'd built this fortress around myself where I was always right and always in control. You threatened that, and I responded by trying to diminish you. It was cruel and it was wrong, and I'm deeply sorry. Marcus was quiet for a moment, absorbing the sincerity in her words. I forgive you, he said. I forgave you the moment you admitted you were wrong, actually. But I appreciate hearing this. She smiled, relief evident in her expression. You're very gracious. More gracious than I deserve. We all deserve grace, Marcus said. We all make mistakes, say things we regret, hurt people we don't mean to hurt. The question isn't whether we mess up, it's whether we learn from it and try to do better. Is that what you did after your wife died? Victoria asked softly. Did you learn and try to do better? Marcus thought about the question, about the 3 years he'd spent hiding in grief, about the moment he decided to step back into the light. I tried to survive, he said honestly, and survival looked like making myself small, invisible, unthreatening. It looked like working a job that didn't challenge me because I was afraid of failing at something that mattered. But then you called me a nobody, and something in me refused to accept that definition. Not because you were wrong about my job, but because I knew I was more than my circumstances. We're all more than our circumstances. Victoria reached across the table and placed her hand over his, a gesture that was both surprising and somehow natural. Thank you, Marcus. For what? For reminding me that there's more to life than proving myself. For showing me that strength and vulnerability aren't opposites, that you can be both at the same time. They sat there for a moment, hands touching across the white tablecloth. Two people who'd found an unexpected connection in the ruins of a terrible first meeting. And Marcus realized that maybe this was what healing looked like. Not a dramatic transformation, but small moments of courage and grace building on each other until you looked back and realized you'd traveled further than you thought possible. 6 months later, Marcus stood on the 42nd floor of Thornridge Tower, watching the installation of the last supplementary column. The renovation was ahead of schedule and under budget, a fact that had earned him respect throughout the company and grudging admiration from the board. But more than that, it had given him something he'd thought he'd lost forever: purpose. The building was transforming around him, not just structurally, but symbolically. Every beam they reinforced, every system they upgraded felt like a metaphor for his own reconstruction. He'd been broken and he was becoming whole again. Not the same person he'd been before Emma died, but someone new. Someone who carried his grief but wasn't crushed by it. Patricia walked over with a tablet showing the latest energy efficiency reports. We're already seeing a 22% reduction in power consumption, and we're only halfway through the HVAC upgrade. At this rate, the renovation will pay for itself in 5 years instead of 7. Marcus smiled, genuinely pleased. That's excellent news. Make sure Kevin sees these numbers. He deserves credit for the system optimization algorithms. Patricia gave him a knowing look. You're good at sharing credit. That's rare in this business. Most engineers I've worked with hoard praise like dragons hoarding gold. I learned a long time ago that the best work happens when everyone feels valued, Marcus said. Besides, this was never about my ego. It was about making something better, something that would last. Speaking of things that last, Patricia said with a mischievous glint in her eye, I saw you and the Ice Queen having coffee in the atrium yesterday. She was actually smiling. I didn't know her face could do that. Marcus felt heat creep up his neck. We were discussing the project timeline. Sure you were, Patricia said, laughing. Look, Marcus, everyone in this building has noticed the change in her. She's still tough, still demanding, but there's a humanity there that wasn't visible before. People are saying you melted the Ice Queen. I didn't melt anything, Marcus protested. She was never ice. She was just protecting herself. We all do that in our own ways. Patricia's expression softened. Well, whatever you did or didn't do, it's good to see. Both of you seem happier. That matters more than any renovation project. She left him alone with his thoughts and the sound of construction happening all around him. The truth was that his relationship with Victoria had evolved into something he couldn't quite define. They had dinner once a week, ostensibly to discuss the project, but really to talk about everything else. Their childhoods, their fears, their dreams. She'd met Sophie, and to Marcus's surprise, they'd gotten along wonderfully. Victoria had shown up to one of their dinners with a children's book about engineering, and had spent an hour explaining to Sophie how bridges work. Sophie had declared Victoria the smartest person she'd ever met besides her daddy, which had made Victoria's eyes shine with unshed tears. Marcus knew he was falling for her despite the complications, despite the professional boundaries, despite the fact that she was technically his boss. He knew, and it terrified him in a way that had nothing to do with his grief over Emma and everything to do with the risk of opening his heart again. His phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. Come to my office when you have a moment. Need to show you something. He made his way to the executive floor, nodding to employees who now greeted him by name, who treated him with the respect his position and his work had earned. He found Victoria standing by her window, looking out at the city below. She turned when he entered, and her smile was immediate and genuine, so different from the Ice Queen mask she used to wear. Marcus, thank you for coming. I wanted to show you this. She handed him a magazine, open to an article titled The Quiet Revolution at Thornridge Industries. Marcus skimmed the article and felt his eyebrows rise. It was a feature story about the building renovation, but it was also about organizational culture change, about how Victoria had implemented new policies around workplace respect and employee recognition. There was even a quote from Dale, his old maintenance supervisor, talking about how the company had started treating facilities workers as valued team members rather than invisible infrastructure. You did this, Marcus said, looking up at her. You changed the entire culture. You inspired it, Victoria corrected. When you stood up to me in that hallway, you didn't just defend yourself. You held up a mirror and showed me who I'd become. Someone who measured people by their titles instead of their character. I didn't like what I saw, so I decided to change it. She walked over to him, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her blue eyes. But it's more than that, Marcus. You showed me that it's possible to be strong and kind at the same time, that vulnerability isn't weakness, and that admitting you're wrong is the first step toward being right. The air between them felt charged with unspoken words and possibility. Marcus knew he should probably maintain professional distance, should think about the complications and the gossip and all the reasons this was a bad idea, but he was tired of being safe. He'd been safe for 3 years and it had nearly destroyed him. Sometimes the bravest thing you could do was take a risk on something beautiful, even if it might not last. Victoria, he said quietly, I need to tell you something. Before he could continue, his phone rang. It was Sophie's school and his heart immediately clenched with parental anxiety. He answered quickly and the school nurse's calm voice came through. Mr. Chun, Sophie is fine, but she's in the nurse's office with a headache. She's asking for you. Can you come pick her up? I'll be there in 15 minutes, Marcus said, already moving toward the door. He looked at Victoria apologetically. I'm sorry, I have to go. Sophie needs me. Go, Victoria said immediately. Family comes first, always. Marcus made it to the school in 12 minutes, breaking a few speed limits in the process. He found Sophie curled up on the nurse's office couch, looking small and miserable. Daddy, she said, reaching for him. My head hurts. He scooped her up, thanking the nurse, and carried her to the car. As he was buckling her into her seat, she looked up at him with eyes that were too knowing for a 7-year-old. Daddy, do you like Victoria? The question caught him completely off guard. What makes you ask that, sweetheart? Because you smile different when you talk about her. Like how you used to smile when you talked about mom, but also different. Like you're happy, but also scared. Marcus sat in the driver's seat and turned to look at his daughter. You're very perceptive, you know that? She nodded seriously. So do you like her? I do, Marcus admitted. Is that okay with you? Does it mean you don't love mom anymore? Sophie asked, her voice small. Oh, sweetie, no. Marcus reached back and took her hand. I will always love your mom. She was my first love and she gave me you, which is the greatest gift anyone ever gave. But mom's not here anymore and I think she'd want me to be happy. I think she'd want both of us to be happy. Sophie was quiet for a moment, processing this with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. I think mom would like Victoria, she said finally. Victoria's smart and she's nice to us and she doesn't treat me like a baby. And she makes you smile the real way, not the pretend way. Marcus felt tears prick his eyes. When did you get so wise? I've always been wise, Daddy, you just finally noticed. He drove them home, his heart full of a complex mixture of love and grief and hope. That evening, after Sophie's headache had subsided and she was settled in bed with her favorite stuffed animal, Marcus sat down and did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He wrote a letter to Emma. He didn't believe in ghosts or that she could somehow read his words from wherever she was, but he needed to say these things, needed to articulate them to make them real. He wrote about his grief and his healing, about Sophie and her wisdom, about the work that had given him purpose again, and he wrote about Victoria, about the unexpected connection that had formed between two broken people who'd found a way to help each other become whole. I think I'm falling in love with her, he wrote, and I feel guilty about that, like I'm betraying you somehow. But I also think you'd understand. You always said that love wasn't a finite resource, that giving it to new people didn't diminish what we had. I miss you every day, Emma, but I'm learning how to live again. And I think that would make you happy. He folded the letter and placed it in the box where he kept Emma's things, her wedding ring and her favorite scarf and the last birthday card she'd given him. Then he picked up his phone and texted Victoria. What I was trying to say in your office before I got called away is this. I think we should stop pretending these dinners are about the project. I like you, Victoria. I like spending time, and I think maybe you feel the same. So if you're interested, I'd like to take you on an actual date. No building schematics allowed. Her response came back within seconds. I thought you'd never ask. Saturday night? It's a date, he replied. And Marcus Chun, former maintenance worker and current facilities engineer, sat in his small apartment and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not just hope or purpose or even happiness, though he felt all of those. What he felt was possibility, the sense that life still held surprises and second chances, that it was never too late to rebuild yourself into something stronger. Outside his window, Thornridge Tower stood against the night sky, its lights blazing, a structure made of steel and concrete and human ingenuity. Inside its walls, 5,000 people worked and dreamed and built their own futures. And somewhere in that tower, in a corner office overlooking the city, Victoria Thornridge sat at her desk and smiled at her phone. No longer the Ice Queen, but simply a woman who'd learned that the bravest thing you could do was let someone see your heart. Two people who'd started as adversaries had become allies, then friends, and now something more. Two people who'd learned that you measured a life not by its moments of perfection, but by its capacity for growth, for change, for the courage to keep building even when everything felt broken. They were both still works in progress, both still healing, both still learning, but they were learning together, and that made all the difference.